Welcome to Cut the Crop, keeping you in the know about everything you grow. Researchers, growers and other interesting folk delivering insights and information on topics ranging from agronomy to profitability. Brought to you by the Foundation for Arable Research.
This podcast episode for Cut the Crop is from the 2023 FAR conference, where Dirk Wallace from FAR speaks around emissions pricing and where the silver lining may lie.
Today I'm going to talk about why we're pricing emissions in agriculture. I'm going to talk about what I know about emissions pricing in agriculture and what's coming up. And then I'm going to talk about some actions that you could actually take on farm this season to reduce your emission number. So hopefully there's a few of you still interested. New Zealand has set a target to achieve net zero emissions from nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide by 2050. And this figure will explain what we're trying to do there. So along the bottom axis you can see time, or you probably can't, but it starts in 1990 on the far left and it ends in 2050 on the far right. And up the y-axis, which is going straight up and down there, you can see our emission numbers. And those are in, I think they're in millions of tonnes per year. The yellow squiggle is our net emissions. And the best way to think about net emissions is that it's the total amount of stuff going up into the atmosphere minus what we're removing from the atmosphere through sequestration, through forestry, etc. So it's kind of the total change in that concentration of greenhouse gases. The green squiggle up the top is gross emissions. And our targets are represented here. So this is the goal. This is New Zealand's goal. We're trying to achieve two things. We're trying to achieve a methane target and a nitrous oxide and CO2 target. The nitrous oxide and CO2 target is that red dot, so it's a net zero emission by 2050. The methane one always takes a lot longer to describe. So I've actually had to write it down, but what we're hoping to achieve is a 24 to 47% reduction below 2017 levels by 2050. And I think this figure does a good job of showing that because it gives you a nice oblong box to show the unknownness of that target. So today, sorry to anyone that's very passionate about methane, but I'll be focusing on the CO2 and N2O goal, and that goal being net zero by 2050. Now, New Zealand's got a pathway to get there. We've got legislation in place that came from when we signed the Paris Agreement. We weren't the only ones to sign up there. We've got 194 other countries signed up to that, plus the EU. So largely it's the direction of travel. And we've set our goal, and we also have set 5 yearly revisions of how we're going. Now, I've been the extreme optimist and said we're going to have a linear trajectory towards our net zero goal. Anyone that's tried to achieve anything ambitious ever knows that there's speed wobbles and progress isn't linear. But let's start off being hopeful. So I just wanted to point out that although New Zealand set these ambitious goals around net zero, we're also seeing corporations set the goals too, so it's bigger than government. These are some of the goals that Kraft Heinz and Nestle have set. They're aiming to get to carbon zero by 2050, and we're seeing partnerships appear with other agricultural sectors. So Fonterra and Nestle are combining their powers to try to produce I think it's the world's first commercially viable net zero emission dairy farm. So interesting stuff happening in this place across the board. So that kind of gives you an idea of the goal, and I just want to reinforce that the reason pricing's coming on, or that original question of the why, is that money talks, right? So by putting a price on emitting, it's meant to incentivise us to reduce the amount we emit, and by putting a price on sequestration or planting trees and providing a financial benefit in that direction, it should increase the amount of removals from the atmosphere. So both of those goals are getting us towards that net zero target. So that's kind of why the pricing is coming into it. Here's the slide you've all been waiting for. This is what I know about agricultural emission pricing, or at least this is how I feel. So I've been working in this place for the last 3 years, and I know that agricultural emissions pricing is there. I know it's big, but I can't stand up in front of you right now and tell you what the price will be, who you'll pay it to, or where you'll pay it. So basically, there's a lot of stuff on the table and still a lot of unknowns, but just wanted you to know from the outset that we're chipping away at it, and we'll let you know as soon as we do. This is my rather short list of knowns around pricing emissions. As I said before, a price is being put in place to incentivise change and get us towards that net zero goal. I also know that the government's currently considering 2 emissions pricing options. One is the one that He Waka and Noa, the primary sector partnership, came up with, and that was built around incentivising on-farm behaviour change in the emission space across all the sectors. So it's currently up for consideration. Our other option is moving into the ETS. According to legislation, by 2025, agricultural emissions will be priced. You can see some asterisks there. About a week before I started making this slide deck, every party under the sun started telling me that this list was now going to get shorter and I was going to know less about pricing emissions. So let's wait and see what happens after October, but just want to let you know that I'm working to have more on this list next time rather than less. So the other thing we know and we can measure is actually what's happening in the atmosphere. What is happening with the concentration of greenhouse gases? It's a little bit easier to understand than policy in some regards. This figure here is some data out of the US showing you what the concentration of nitrous oxide is in the atmosphere from 800,000 years ago, and that was measured from ice cores, to now, and that's the left-hand side of that figure, and then from 1950 to 2021. And you can see, well, hopefully you can see, according to that historical record, we're a fair bit above where we used to be. And over the last 70 years or so, it's a fairly linear trajectory of increasing concentration of that gas. The reason I've picked on nitrous oxide here is that nitrous oxide is actually the dominant gas to come from arable cropping. When people think about arable, they normally think about tractors and diesel and everything like that. But actually the nitrous oxide that comes from applying fertiliser is going to be your main source of emission in an arable cropping context. So now you know why pricing's coming, and you also know what's happening with the pricing component and the concentration of greenhouse gases. Hopefully some of you are starting to think about, all right, well, what can I even do? It's always the question. It's a big problem. It's a worldwide problem. What impact can you even have? I think the main point I want to make here is that you can have a lot more impact than most people. To put it in context, when you're applying fertiliser onto your crops, you get the same amount of emissions from applying 1 tonne of nitrogen as urea as you do if you were to jump on an aeroplane and fly to Chicago and back. So it kind of puts it in perspective that potentially small changes in decision-making practices on farm can have really big impacts. Now the next part is always, where do you start? It's a big problem, like I said before. Now hopefully you're all thinking, oh yeah, I could actually get us towards that net zero. But you need to start somewhere, and this is where a lot of things fall over. So next I want to cover off a bit of an action plan as to where you can go with this. The first step I'd say is much like DIE, know your numbers. Arable's diverse. You don't all have the same number. Averages don't really work for us. So getting one of those calculators out and working out what your greenhouse gas number is the best place to start. This figure's got 42 of the arable farm performance sites on it. So these are all arable businesses, and this is the range of arable emission numbers we're seeing. That red line represents the average. You can kind of see that not many businesses are touching that average. So knowledge is power in this space. Knowing your own number is the best way to move forward, I think. Now I kind of need a bit of a drum roll here because we're coming up to the silver lining that I'm sure many of you have been waiting for, right? So once you've got your number, like Di was saying, have a think about it. That's where the silver lining in this whole thing is. You've got your greenhouse gas number is made up of your stock purchased and sold, and also your fert purchased. And those are probably, some of your bigger investments on farm. So you've got that information staring you in the face, and that allows an opportunity for you to look at that and start to think about whether there's any room for gaining efficiency in your system. Can you put less in, but get the same amount out? And at its core, that's what efficiency is, and that's one of the focuses of this session. So having a think about what you can do is really the silver lining, in my opinion. Now, the list of things you can actually do currently is relatively short, or it can be made relatively short, and that's what I've tried to do here. As of today, I'd say your current emission reduction opportunities in an arable business are to reduce the amount of nitrogen fertiliser applied, or finish stock faster or on less feed. I'm going to focus on the reducing nitrogen fertiliser applied part for the next few slides and just show you some of the research that we've been doing and some of the things growers have been learning on farm. But obviously that movement towards more efficient nitrogen use will reduce emissions as well. Now, I also want to point out that there is other technologies coming on board. There's a great list of technologies that may be coming. Those that were listening to Louis Schipper's talk this morning, he was talking about grinding up basalt and applying that. They're all in the pipeline, but this list is actually things you can do today. And when it comes to reducing emissions, the best option is getting onto something you can do today. So the first thing I want to talk about when it comes to reducing nitrogen fertiliser is starting at the start. Quite simply put, revising whether you're getting the right amount in, and that's just like what Roger and Pete were talking about before. So I'll walk you through some information from our Waikato research site and our Chertsey research site as to what we've been learning about how we can lean more on understanding soil nitrogen supply to feed the crop. So this figure here, well, these photos here show you two different nitrogen decisions that we've been applying to maize and also wheat. We've used a standard nitrogen rate, which is actually just feeding the crop everything it needs as nitrogen fertiliser, essentially replacing removal, and a good management nitrogen rate, where we do that same, we aim to replace what we remove, but we subtract our soil nitrogen supply. And that, in this instance, is soil mineral nitrogen, so what's beneath your boots, and an estimate of nitrogen mineralisation through the season. So estimating how much you'll get each month of the growing season under average conditions. And we've used the potentially mineralisable nitrogen test to help us with that. So you can see good management versus standard N, no difference in maize yield in 2021-22, but we were able to reduce the amount of fertiliser we put in by 30%, and because the amount of emission that comes out of fertiliser is correlated, that also means we've reduced emissions by 30% by using that soil nitrogen supply. We're doing this trial year on year in the same spot because long-term nitrogen trials like this are actually not all that commonly done. So in 2022 and 23, we repeated this. We used a different model. This time it's me. But again, we saw no significant difference in yield, and we saw an even greater reduction in fertiliser applied. So we reduced fertiliser applied by 42% this time, and emissions by 42%. Now, the reason that happened was we got more understanding of how to use the PMN test as Plant and Food Research published their guidelines on how to actually use the thing and apply it with a fertiliser decision. So confidence is going up, and that's a good thing. We've also done the same theory with wheat at Chertsey. So in 2021 and 22, this is a irrigated feed wheat. we were able to reduce the fertiliser applied and maintain yield. So we reduced the fertiliser applied by 25%. In 2022-23, we reduced fertiliser applied by 37%. So opportunity to use soil nitrogen supply is there, and we're seeing that it's not significantly affecting yield, but it is pulling emissions back and also nitrogen cost back as well. So it's got an economic benefit. Now, it's nice to look at stuff that's done at research sites, but one of the things we've been doing working with Growers Leading Change is actually understanding what this would look like on farm. This is some data from the Waikato, where 3 maize growers took the risk of doing something that was recommended by Pete Berry a few presentations ago and doing a small tramline tryout. So what they've done is they've compared their standard fertiliser rate versus either a no nitrogen or a low nitrogen, so the trial wouldn't get side dressed, for example. These areas don't need to be big. They can be small and you can still learn a lot. But what you can see is that the difference in yield is fairly negligible. So when you sit around a table with growers looking at data like this and their yields from their no or low treatments come back as very low, it's a real eye-opening experience for them. And I just want to point out here that maybe some of the soil testing stuff might seem too far to go this season, but even flicking off the broadcaster and just having a look at an area can inform a lot of, it can provide a lot of information on how much nitrogen your soil's actually applying. So in summary, pricing is going to be part of the process to get to that goal of net zero. It's kind of coming, and we'll provide more information as we know more, but we're currently in a bit of a holding pattern. The things to do this season, if you haven't already, is calculate your number and start to look for opportunities to improve that. We recently have had some levy returns come back with a question around who knows their number, and about half arable growers do. So there's room for improvement on that front. And in terms of what you could do this season to reduce emissions, the number one thing is to start looking at opportunities to be more efficient with nitrogen, and reducing the amount applied seems to be the easiest place to start.
Thanks for tuning in to Cut the Crop, presented to you by FAR. If you'd like to know more about any of the topics discussed or have any suggestions for future topics, go to www.cutthecrop.co.nz.